Episode 5. The Normans are coming, and that's bad news for the Welsh.
Thanks for joining me again for the latest episode of this podcast, re-exploring the journey I took, a 300-mile walking journey through the woodlands of Wales for the book called Return to My Trees. Today, we're going to be wandering across the countryside of southeast Wales, between Newport and Cardiff, and specifically we're going to be visiting the village of Draethon and then Rudry. Our topic is the Normans and the havoc they brought to the Welsh who lived in this area when they arrived.
Today's walk is starting off in Basilic, which is a small village just north of Newport. And specifically, I'm at St. Basil's or Basil's Church, which some believe was dedicated to Gladys, our hermit saint who we met in the last episode, who was married to Gwynllew and was the mother of Cadog. She is said to have set up her hermitage on the banks of the River Ebu, which is just a few hundred metres away from here. Anyway, I'm leaving Basilic, and I'm going to walk today through the countryside and over the hills to the town of Caerphilly. I set out up a busy road and then soon find myself out on a country road heading towards Parkwood. I can see a few farms dotted around. In the distance are wooded hills and the villages of Draethon and Rudry. Now, by the end of the 7th century, the Brythonic peoples living in the west of Britain found themselves cut off from their compatriots in the north of England on the Scottish borders. Wave upon wave of Saxon attacks had pacified most of England, but the physical obstacles of the Welsh mountain ranges had kept the Saxons from overrunning what we now consider to be Wales. Of course, that didn't stop the local inhabitants living to the west of the Saxon lands from launching guerrilla attacks and raiding parties before disappearing back into the highlands and woods. So, sometime in the mid-8th century, Offa, the Saxon king of Mercia, decided he'd had enough of this western nuisance and walled off his land by building an imposing earthen dike running some 150 miles from north to south. This became the de facto eastern border of what we now know as Wales. And within this cut-off land, the modern Welsh people and language began to emerge and flourish. The territory was divided into a number of kingdoms, all vying for hegemony. Apart from a few urban settlements along the coast, the majority of people in what was becoming Wales lived a rural existence, based around simple farming and a dependence on the woodlands for hunting and foraging. What little we know about people's relationship to the land and nature at this time comes from the Welsh laws, believed to have been laid down by King Hywel Dda, Hywel the Good, in the 10th century. Surviving manuscripts of the Welsh laws suggest there was little institutional ownership of the woods at this time. People were largely free to use them for hunting and as a source of fuel and raw materials for building and utensils. The law made specific reference to Coed Cadw, preserved woodland, a legal term for woodland that was protected for pannage and wood products. But there was also reference to Forest y Brynin, the King's Forest, a term used in relation to land that had been reserved for royal hunting. There's a little pathway leading off the country track, so I'm going to take it now, and it leading me into Parkwood. Now, this is one of those under-the-radar pieces of woodland that only the local people really know about. It's not listed on the Woodland Trust map of woods in Wales, but it's exactly the type of small, mixed woodland that could help piece together a navigable national forest route through Wales, which is why I'm including it on my Return to My Trees trail. I can't find anything about its history, but it feels like the sort of woodland that local folks in the age of Hywel Dda would have relied on. And it wouldn't have sat isolated like it does today, a lone island of woodland in a sea of monotonous farmland. The Book of Llandaff, a 12th century account of all the land that the church's seat of power claimed to own, describes how much of this area was wooded. It provided numerous mentions of forests, woods and groves, and also described how species including alder, willow, yews and ash were used as boundary features, marker trees or woods. So I've just emerged out of Park Wood. It was a bit muddy, but a pleasant little escape, little haven of woodlands. And now I've emerged into bright green fields, and they're alive with purple, yellow and white wildflowers. There are orange and black butterflies, painted ladies maybe, darting through the meadow. And I've picked up what I believe to be the Rumney River Circular Walk, a structured public footpath that leads through the countryside here and leads into the village of Drayton. Ahead of me, I can see a crossing point across the Rumney River, and that, I believe, is the Old Iron Bridge. So I'm going to head there and see if I can actually cross and get back into the village. Okay, so I've made it to the bridge. And the Old Iron Bridge was built in 1829, and it's looking its age. But it was built to allow horse-drawn carriages to travel between the nearby Rupera Castle estate and the church at Machen, a few miles away. Now, today, Rupera is pretty much a ruin. It is kind of a square, very elegant-looking house, but it has fallen into some sort of disrepair. But once, it really was a grand affair, the second home of the Morgan family, whose family seat was a few miles away at Tredegar House in Newport. Now, the Morgans were true Welsh royalty, certainly able to trace their lineage back to Rhys ap Tudor, King of Deheubarth in West Wales, while some of the family liked to claim that they were descendants of the Silurian leader Caradog. Remember, the one who chose to stay in Rome rather than return to Gwent. In the 13th century, the Morgans built a home at Tredegar House, and 300 years and a few generations of Morgans later, they acquired Rupera Castle, which they then maintained as their second home. In the early 20th century, it became the main home of Evan Morgan, a poet and keen follower of the occult, whose friendship with larger-than-life literary and artistic figures like Brave New World author Aldous Huxley, the painter Augustus John, H.G. Wells and the poet Robert Graves, a noted Druid expert, certainly raised eyebrows in this sleepy part of South Wales. The Morgan fortune was in steep decline by this time, and Evan had to abandon Rupera in 1941, but not before turning down an offer by the American newspaper magnate William Randolph Hearst, who was shopping around for a stately home and wanted to buy Rupera. Ultimately, he ended up buying a St. Donat's castle on the coast of South Wales. Just over 1,000 years ago, all of the land in this part of South Wales would have been controlled by descendants of Welsh royalty. But change was coming from the east that would reshape Wales beyond recognition. In 1066, William the Conqueror invaded the British Isles from Normandy, defeating the Saxon King Harold at the Battle of Hastings, and so the Norman conquest of Britain began. William's French knights, lords and barons moved swiftly through England. However, making inroads into Wales proved a tougher proposition. In the Welsh, the Normans encountered a populace who were used to living in the fluidity of the constant domestic regime, and could put up with the odd English incursion. The Normans, however, displayed a gratuitous cruelty that the Welsh wouldn't tolerate, and so they started a 20-year campaign of guerrilla warfare, launching attacks from bases deep in the woods. As the Welsh Norman travel writer Giraldus Cambrensis, Gerald of Wales, recounted on a trip through Wales nearly a century later in 1188, the local people neither inhabit towns, villages, nor castles, but lead a solitary life in the woods, on the borders of which they content themselves with small huts made out of the boughs of trees twisted together, constructed with little labour or expense, and sufficient to endure throughout the year. The Normans soon realised the threat posed by the woodland assaults. Over the next century, they embarked on a military strategy not seen in Wales since Roman times, systematically felling forests to eliminate the threat of ambush. In 1277, during one particularly brutal act of arborcide, King Edward I advanced into North Wales from his border stronghold of Chester with a dual army, one made up of soldiers and another of woodsmen, including sawyers, woodcutters, carpenters and charcoal burners, who cut an invasion roadway some 230 metres wide with another 60 metres of clearance on either side through the dense forests for over 30 miles until they reached the town of Conwy. The woodland historian William Linnard estimated that to make way for this road, up to 2,000 acres of woodland were cut down in just 4 to 5 months. Another military tree attack took place not far from where I'm right now. In 1287, a 600-strong force of woodsmen cut a path from Glamorgan to Brecon via the Taff Valley. This process of taming the Welsh by felling the forests was repeated over and over until 1283, when Edward I took complete control of Wales by defeating Llywelyn the Last, King of Gwynedd. Ultimately, wrote Linnard, the axe and the flame were weapons just as important as the lance and the bow. I've made it to Coed Cefn Pwll. These are woods above the village of Drayton. Here, the landscape is pockmarked with large holes dug underground. Once these were old lead and silver mines that made this part of Glamorgan so important before the Industrial Revolution took hold. It was a miracle that I hadn't got myself stuck in one of them. The Romans exploited these mines when they were based in Caerleon, and mining continued at a pace through the preceding centuries. Local industrialists worked and leased mines extensively in this woodland from the 17th century onwards, so much so that by the 19th century this land had been exhausted of its mineral wealth. So many mines had been dug that parts of the hillside, from Drayton to Machen, looked like Swiss cheese. Nowadays the forest has grown back with such a vigour that many of the sunken holes are camouflaged. So much so that the local council has cordoned them off, partly to stop idiots like me falling into them, but also to prevent amateur spelunkers exploring and getting stuck. A country lane leads into the village of Rudry and onto a new footpath. It climbs through Coed Cefn Wood. The name means hillside of ash trees in Welsh, and emerges onto the ridgeway that separates Cardiff from Caerphilly and the threshold of the South Wales valleys. Today has been a bit of a revelation for me. I'm only 9 miles from home, and I've certainly driven around this area many times, but I've never explored these woods and the nature in them that are pretty much on my own doorstep. It feels like I'm on a real adventure. What's more, I've only just started. From this high vantage point, I can see the whole of Cardiff spread out below. The bronze-coloured dome of the Millennium Centre Theatre shines bright, reflecting the late afternoon sun. The outside exoskeleton design of the Principality Rugby Stadium dominates the city centre. It resembles an alien ship from the War of the Worlds. Off the coast, the islands of Steepholm and Flatholm sit like 2 giant stepping stones across the Bristol Channel. If I turn around and look north, One landmark alone takes centre stage: Caerphilly Castle. Its intimidating towers and moat overshadow everything else around, as it has for nearly 1,000 years. During the first 200 years of occupation, the Norman lords built castles to protect themselves from wave after wave of Welsh rebellion, many feeding on the grievances of local people whose lands were being seized. Most Celtic castles had been erected using wood. The Normans put their faith in thick stone walls to repel their foes. In North Wales, King Edward I built what he termed a ring of iron, spending over £80,000, about 58 million today, on fortifications. Here in South Wales, he constructed new castles or adapted old Welsh castles at Chepstow, Cardiff and Pembroke. But the biggest and most imposing of all was Caerphilly, and it would play a dramatic role in reshaping the relationship of Welsh people to the woodlands that they had long lived among and depended upon. It was also the starting point for my next walk. You've been listening to Return to My Trees, a Tramping podcast. It was narrated by Matthew Yeomans and edited by Dullan Yeomans. The musical interludes are by the folk duo Filkin's Drift. Join us for the next episode, where we delve even deeper into the woodlands of Wales.